You are actively betting against your own family. Do you understand what that makes you? My brother said those words to me in the lobby of the building our grandfather built, loud enough that 3 employees pretended very hard not to be listening. I didn't answer him. I couldn't, not without unraveling everything I'd spent 4 months building in silence. So I let him believe what everyone else believed. That I was the daughter who turned on her own father the moment his empire started to wobble. But by the time the SEC's report became public, the story would flip so completely that half the people who spat on my name that spring would be the same ones asking me, quietly, privately, to forgive them. My name is Claire Whitfield, and for most of my life I thought the worst thing I could ever do to my father was disappoint him. I didn't understand yet that there was something far worse. Loving him enough to let him hate me for a while, so he could survive. I grew up inside Whitfield Properties the way other kids grow up inside a family restaurant or a farm. It wasn't a company to me. It was the air in the house. My father, Richard Whitfield, had taken a single strip mall his own father left him and turned it, over 30 years, into a name that meant something in 4 states. Luxury residential towers. Mixed-use developments. A skyline in 3 different cities that had his fingerprints on it, even if his name wasn't on the building itself. He used to drive me past a half-finished high-rise when I was maybe 8 years old and say, "Someday people are going to live their whole lives inside something I imagined first." I believed him completely. I still do, in a way. That's what made everything that came later so hard to carry. My older brother, Grant, was always going to run the company. That was never a question, not to my father, not to Grant, not really to anyone. He had the right instincts for it, or at least the right hunger. He liked the deal-making, the ribbon cuttings, the version of the business that got photographed. I liked something else entirely. I liked the numbers underneath the ribbon cuttings. While Grant was learning how to work a room, I was in my father's home office at 13 years old, quietly working through spreadsheets he'd left open on the desktop, not because anyone asked me to, but because I found something almost peaceful in the way numbers either lined up or they didn't. There was no charm in a balance sheet. No performance. Either the assets covered the liabilities or they didn't. I loved that honesty long before I understood how rare it actually was in the business my family was in. I went a different direction than either of them expected. Finance, not real estate. An analyst job at a mid-sized investment firm in the city, the kind of place where nobody cared whose daughter you were, they only cared whether your models held up under pressure. My father called it a phase for the first 2 years. Then he called it my rebellion. Eventually he stopped calling it anything at all, and I think that quiet stopped hurting less than the teasing had. I wasn't running from Whitfield Properties. I was trying to understand, from a distance, whether I actually respected what it had become, or whether I only loved what it used to be. That distance is the only reason I noticed anything wrong at all. It started with something almost embarrassingly small. A due diligence request crossed my desk in late autumn, a routine credit analysis on a real estate portfolio our firm was considering for a structured investment product. Not Whitfield Properties directly, but a regional lender that had extended significant financing to several of my father's projects. I wasn't even looking for my family's name. I was looking at loan-to-value ratios and debt service coverage numbers on 12 unrelated properties. And then I saw it. A footnote, 3 pages deep in an appendix nobody was supposed to read closely, referencing occupancy rates for 2 Whitfield residential towers that didn't match the numbers my father's own investor materials had circulated to the public just 2 quarters earlier. At first I told myself it was a clerical error. People misreport things. Spreadsheets get corrupted, columns get dragged wrong, someone copies last year's numbers into this year's template by accident. I have built enough models to know how easily an honest mistake hides inside a professional-looking document. So I did what any analyst would do. I pulled the public filings. I cross-referenced them against permit records, against utility usage data that's a matter of public record in most municipalities, against a handful of satellite occupancy estimates a colleague of mine used for an unrelated retail analysis. And the picture that emerged wasn't a clerical error. It was a pattern. Whitfield Properties had been reporting occupancy and rental income on at least 4 properties that were, according to every external data point I could find, running significantly below what the company was telling its lenders and its investors. Not by a rounding error. By enough that it materially changed the valuation of the properties, which materially changed the collateral backing hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, which materially changed the picture of solvency the entire company had been presenting to banks, bondholders, and, eventually, the public markets. I sat with that for 3 days before I told anyone, and even then, I didn't tell my family. I told a friend from graduate school, a securities lawyer named Priya, because I needed someone to tell me I was wrong, or at least that I was overreacting. She read through what I'd assembled in my kitchen at 11 at night, and she got very quiet in a way that lawyers only get quiet when something is serious. "Claire," she said finally, "if even half of this holds up, this isn't an accounting irregularity. This is fraud. And if it's been going on as long as this data suggests, you need to think very carefully about what happens when it comes out. Because it will come out. The only question is how, and who controls the how." I want to be honest about something, because there's a version of this story where I present myself as some kind of righteous crusader from the very beginning, and that isn't quite true. My first instinct wasn't justice. My first instinct was panic. Because underneath the numbers, underneath the fraud, underneath the legal exposure, was my father. Was the man who taught me to ride a bike in the parking lot of his first commercial property because he said it was good luck. Was the man who, whatever distance had grown between us, still called me every single year on the anniversary of my mother's death, not to talk about anything in particular, just so neither of us had to sit with that date completely alone. I wasn't looking at a company. I was looking at the possible unraveling of the only parent I had left. So I did the thing that I now understand most people would find hardest to believe, and the thing that would eventually make me look, to everyone who loved me, like a traitor. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Grant. I called Priya back 3 days later and asked her a very different question. Not, how do I expose this, but if the SEC eventually finds this on their own, what happens to my father? Personally. Criminally. Not the company, him. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she explained something to me that changed the entire shape of what I was about to do. If regulators discover accounting fraud of this scale on their own, through a whistleblower complaint or a routine audit trigger or a competitor's tip, the company and its executives are treated as having concealed wrongdoing. That posture, concealment discovered from the outside, tends to produce the harshest outcomes. Criminal referrals. Personal liability for executives who signed off on the misstatements, which my father, as CEO, absolutely had. Potential prison exposure, not just fines. But if a company gets ahead of it, if it self-reports, cleans house, restates its financials and cooperates before regulators come knocking, the calculus changes completely. Self-reporting doesn't erase the fraud. But it is, in nearly every documented case Priya had worked, the single biggest factor in whether an executive walks away with a settlement and a bruised legacy, or a federal indictment and years in a courtroom followed by years somewhere much worse. The problem was obvious and enormous. My father had no idea I'd found anything. And even if I told him tonight, tomorrow, next week, there was no guarantee he would choose to self-report. People in his position rarely do voluntarily, not because they're evil, but because denial is a much more comfortable place to live than confession, and because admitting the fraud meant admitting he'd built the last several years of his empire on numbers that weren't real. I understood my father well enough to know that if I walked into his office with spreadsheets and said, "The company is lying and you need to turn yourself in," he would not hear his daughter trying to save him. He would hear an accusation, and he would defend himself the way he'd defended every deal, every rival, every threat to Whitfield Properties for 30 years. By fighting. So I decided to force his hand in a way he couldn't argue with, couldn't spin, couldn't simply deny his way out of. I decided to make the fraud visible to the market itself, in a way that would create enough external pressure that self-reporting became the only rational move left, before regulators arrived on their own timeline and took the choice away from him entirely. I opened a position through a separate brokerage account, one with no connection to my employer or my family name, using a modest inheritance from my mother that I had never touched, money I'd always privately thought of as something I'd save for a house someday. I began shorting Whitfield Properties stock and the associated commercial mortgage-backed securities tied to the properties I now knew were misrepresented. Not a small position. A significant one, built carefully over several weeks so as not to trigger unusual volume alerts, layered through options as well as direct short positions to maximize the signal without revealing my identity behind it. I want to explain, because I know how this sounds from the outside, exactly what I believed I was doing, because it matters. I was not betting against my father to profit from his downfall, though I understood the position would be profitable if I was right, and that fact alone would later be used against me as if profit had been the entire point. I was manufacturing pressure. A large unexplained short position against a real estate company, combined with the whisper network that exists in every financial market, tends to attract attention. Analysts start asking questions. Journalists who cover real estate start calling around. Competing firms start digging for weaknesses to exploit publicly. I was betting that the scrutiny itself, arriving from outside, anonymous and market-driven rather than traceable back to a jealous rival or a disgruntled employee, would force Whitfield Properties Board and its outside auditors to take a harder look at the numbers before regulators did it for them. I was trying to make the fire visible from far enough away that my father's own people would be the ones to put it out, quietly, on their own terms, before it became an inferno that consumed him personally. It worked faster than I expected, and slower than I needed, both at the same time. Within 6 weeks, a well-known short seller research outfit, completely unconnected to me, picked up on the unusual trading activity and began its own investigation into Whitfield Properties' occupancy claims. They published a report. It was thorough, it was public, and it was devastating. The stock dropped nearly 30% in 2 trading sessions. Lenders started asking questions about loan covenants. And my father, for the first time in his life, found his company's name attached to words like alleged accounting discrepancies in publications that used to only ever write about his ribbon cuttings. I remember exactly where I was when Grant called me, because it was the last conversation we had before everything I'd built collapsed into the version of the story everyone believed instead of the truth. I was at my desk. He didn't say hello. He said, "Are you seeing this?" And I said something careful, something non-committal, because I still believed, in that moment, that I could ride this out anonymously, that my position would never be traced back to me, that I could simply be a supportive daughter on the outside while the mechanism I'd built did its work in the shadows. I was wrong about that, and the way I was wrong is its own kind of lesson about how thoroughly you can underestimate the people who love you. It was Grant who found it, not the SEC, not a journalist, not my father. Grant, who had inherited enough of our father's instincts to be genuinely gifted at due diligence when he chose to apply himself, decided to investigate who exactly was behind the short position that had triggered the research report, because he suspected a competitor was trying to manufacture a hostile acquisition opportunity out of the chaos. He traced the brokerage account back through a chain of filings that I had believed, wrongly, were more anonymous than they actually were. It took him 4 days. And when he found my name attached to it, he did not call me privately, quietly, to ask if there was an explanation. He walked into my father's office, laid the documentation on his desk, and said, in front of 2 other executives, "Claire did this. Claire is the one who's been shorting us." By the time I heard about it, it wasn't a private family matter anymore. It was already the version of the story everyone had agreed on before I ever got a chance to explain myself. My sister-in-law stopped answering my texts within the hour. My aunt, my father's sister, called me directly, something she almost never did, and said, with a kind of controlled fury I'd never heard from her, "Your mother would be ashamed of you." That sentence took something out of me that I don't think I've fully gotten back, even now. Because my mother was gone, and couldn't defend me, and couldn't hear the explanation I hadn't been given the chance to give anyone yet. The lobby confrontation with Grant happened the following morning. I'd gone to the office, our family's headquarters, not my own firm, because I needed to see my father in person, needed to at least attempt to explain before this went any further. Grant was waiting for me instead. He stood in front of the elevator bank so I couldn't get past him, and he said the words that opened this story. "You are actively betting against your own family. Do you understand what that makes you?" I remember looking past him at the wall behind the reception desk, at the black and white photograph of our grandfather standing in front of that first strip mall, and thinking that he, at least, would have wanted someone to ask a harder question before the whole thing burned down around him. But I didn't say that. I said, "I need to see Dad." Grant laughed, not kindly. "He doesn't want to see you." He said, and I'm quoting him, that he'd rather deal with the SEC than deal with his own daughter right now. I found out later that wasn't quite accurate, that Grant had, whether consciously or not, sharpened my father's actual words into something crueler before repeating them to me, the way information gets sharpened every time it passes between people who are hurting. But in that moment I had no way of knowing that, and it cut exactly the way it was meant to. I left the building without seeing him. The next 2 weeks were the loneliest of my adult life, and I say that as someone who has genuinely known loneliness before. My father did not call. Grant made it clear through several intermediaries that I was, in his words, not welcome at the company or at family gatherings until, quote, this was resolved. My aunt told other relatives a version of events that painted me as someone who'd been secretly resentful of the family business for years and had finally found a way to sabotage it from the shadows for personal profit. And the public version wasn't any kinder. Someone, I never found out who, leaked my name to a business reporter, and a headline ran with a version of the story that had almost none of the actual context. Whitfield heirs secretly bet against family empire, sparked market panic. Reading my own name in that sentence, stripped of everything I actually believed about why I'd done it, was one of the strangest kinds of grief I've ever experienced. Grief for a version of myself that a stranger had invented and that thousands of people now believed was the real one. I want to pause here and say something honest about what that period taught me, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters most, more than the fraud, more than the money, more than the eventual vindication. There is a particular kind of pain in being misunderstood by people who love you, that is worse, in some ways, than being genuinely wronged by a stranger. A stranger's judgment doesn't require you to explain your whole heart to change their mind, because you never expected them to know your heart in the first place. But when your own brother looks at you and sees a saboteur instead of the person who used to fall asleep on his shoulder during long car rides, something in you has to decide whether to keep insisting on being known, or whether to let the misunderstanding stand because the alternative, breaking your silence too early, might cost the very person you're trying to protect. I chose silence. I still believe, even now, that it was the right choice, though I will never stop wishing there had been a version of events where I didn't have to choose between being understood and being effective. Because here is the thing I couldn't explain to Grant, to my aunt, to the reporter, to anyone, without destroying the entire strategy before it had time to work. Priya had been very clear with me from the very beginning. If word got out that this pressure campaign was being orchestrated by the CEO's own daughter, using material knowledge of the company's actual books, the entire narrative would shift instantly from the market discovered a problem to an insider deliberately manipulated the stock, which would open an entirely separate and arguably more dangerous line of legal exposure, not just for me, but potentially recharacterizing the whole situation as market manipulation rather than legitimate short selling based on public information, which could complicate or even undermine my father's ability to credibly self-report as a company that had simply been caught by external scrutiny. My silence wasn't stubbornness. It was structural. The entire mechanism only worked if it looked, from the outside, exactly like what everyone already believed it was. A betrayal. While I was being frozen out of my own family, something was happening that I could only watch from a distance, the way you watch weather roll in on a radar map, unable to affect it, only to track it. The research report and the resulting stock collapse had done exactly what I hoped it would. Whitfield Properties Board, facing a genuine market crisis and mounting pressure from lenders who were now reviewing every covenant in every loan agreement, brought in an outside auditing firm to conduct an emergency review of the properties named in the report. I later learned, through Priya, who had her own contacts tracking the situation, that my father resisted this at first, insisted the numbers were defensible, insisted this was a coordinated attack by short sellers looking to profit off a temporary dip. That resistance lasted exactly 9 days. On the 10th day, the outside auditors found what I had found 4 months earlier, except now they had subpoena-adjacent authority and forensic accountants and no personal stake in protecting him. I don't know exactly what happened in the room when my father was finally shown the full extent of what his own finance team, led by a longtime executive named Doug Kessler who had been with the company for nearly 20 years, had actually done. I know, because Priya eventually confirmed it through channels that became public during the settlement process, that it was Doug, not my father directly, who had been the primary architect of the inflated occupancy figures, going back nearly 5 years, initially to help the company qualify for a refinancing package during a rough quarter, and then continuing the practice because reversing it would have required admitting the original deception. I know that my father had signed off on aggregate financial statements without personally auditing every underlying property, the way most CEOs of companies that size do, trusting the people beneath him. I want to be careful here, because I'm not interested in making my father sound like an innocent bystander in his own company's fraud. He was the CEO. The ultimate responsibility, legally and morally, sat with him regardless of who initially falsified which spreadsheet, and I think, if you asked him today, he would tell you the same thing without flinching. But there is a real difference between a man who orchestrates a fraud and a man who fails to catch one happening under him, and that difference, it turns out, is exactly the difference between what could have happened to him and what actually did. What actually happened is this. 9 days after the emergency audit began, and roughly 2 months after my short position first triggered outside scrutiny, Whitfield Properties Board, on outside counsel's advice, made the decision to voluntarily self-report the discovered accounting irregularities to the Securities and Exchange Commission before the SEC's own routine review, which Priya had separately learned through industry contacts was already being informally discussed as a possibility given the market volatility, had a chance to open independently. The company restated 4 years of financial statements. It terminated Doug Kessler and 2 other executives directly involved. And my father, in a decision that I know cost him more than almost anything else in his professional life, personally appeared before the SEC's enforcement staff, waived certain procedural protections his lawyers advised him he didn't have to waive, and cooperated fully with an investigation that, had it started from the outside instead of from an internal self-report, his own securities lawyers later told him privately, likely would have resulted in a criminal referral rather than a civil settlement. The final resolution took the better part of a year to fully materialize, but the shape of it was set in those first 9 days. Whitfield Properties paid a substantial civil penalty. My father personally paid a significant fine and agreed to a multi-year ban from serving as CEO of a publicly traded company, stepping back into a chairman role instead while Grant, who had spent years positioning himself to run daily operations anyway, formally took over as chief executive. Doug Kessler, whose conduct was found to be knowing and deliberate rather than negligent, faced a much harsher outcome, including a criminal referral that eventually resulted in a guilty plea and a prison sentence. My father did not go to prison. He did not face criminal charges at all. And every lawyer who touched that case, on every side of it, agreed on one thing without exception. If the SEC had discovered this fraud independently, through their own audit trigger, which internal emails later confirmed was already on a watch list timeline roughly 4 to 6 months out, the posture of the entire case would have been concealment rather than cooperation, and concealment, for a fraud of this size and duration, almost never ends with a chairman title and a fine. It ends with handcuffs. I didn't learn most of these details from my father directly. I learned them from Priya, from court filings, from the same business reporters who had once run my name under a headline calling me a saboteur, and were now, with far less fanfare, running quiet corrections that nobody read as widely as the original accusation. I want to sit with that for a second, because it's one of the truest things I've learned about how the world actually works. The accusation always travels faster and louder than the correction. Being right, eventually, does not undo the damage of being misunderstood in the moment when it mattered most. I don't think I've ever fully made peace with that asymmetry. I've just learned to live alongside it. The confrontation that finally broke the silence between my father and me happened almost 5 months after that first lobby conversation with Grant, on the evening the self-report became public knowledge and the initial wave of coverage hit. He called me himself, for the first time since this began, and asked me to come to the house, not the office, the actual house I grew up in, the one with the parking lot where he taught me to ride a bike. I almost didn't go. I sat in my car outside for nearly 20 minutes before I made myself walk to the door, because some part of me was still braced for another version of the lobby, another accusation delivered with someone else standing nearby watching. He opened the door himself. He looked older than he had 5 months earlier, which I know isn't possible in any literal sense, but grief and fear do things to a person's face that time alone doesn't usually manage that quickly. He didn't say hello. He said, "Grant showed me the brokerage records again today. All of them. The full trail, the timing, everything." I remember bracing myself, physically, for the version of this conversation I'd been dreading since the moment I opened that short position 4 months earlier. And then he said something I hadn't braced for at all. "Priya called me last week. She told me what she told you, back in the fall." About what happens to a company that gets caught versus a company that comes forward on its own. He paused for a long time, long enough that I genuinely didn't know which direction the conversation was about to go. I didn't understand, at first, why you didn't just tell me. Why you didn't walk into my office and show me what you found and let me decide what to do with it, like a normal daughter would have. I told him the truth, the whole thing, everything I hadn't been able to say to Grant, to my aunt, to the reporter, to anyone, for 5 months. I told him I knew him well enough to know that if I'd walked in with spreadsheets and an accusation, he would have defended the company, defended himself, defended 30 years of work, the way he defended it against every rival and every downturn his entire career, because that instinct wasn't a character flaw, it was the same instinct that had built the whole empire in the first place, and I couldn't just switch it off with one conversation. I told him I didn't trust that he would choose to self-report voluntarily on his own timeline, not because I thought he was a bad man, but because I understood exactly how much would have to be admitted, how much pride would have to be swallowed, and I didn't believe he could get there fast enough on his own before the SEC's own clock, the one Priya had heard was already ticking somewhere in the background, ran out on its own terms instead of his. I told him I built the pressure because pressure was the only language that could move faster than denial. And I told him, and this was the part that broke something open in both of us at once, that I would rather have him hate me for the rest of his life and be alive and free to hate me, than have him love me right up until the morning federal agents came to escort him out of the office he built with his own hands. He didn't say anything for a long time after that. He walked over to the same window he used to stand at when I was a kid, looking out at the exact parking lot from the story he used to tell me, and he said, very quietly, almost too quiet for me to hear at first, "Your grandfather used to say something to me, back when I was young and just starting out. He said the real estate business isn't actually about buildings. It's about trust. People trusting that the walls will hold, that the numbers are real, that the man standing in front of them isn't lying about what's underneath the foundation." He turned around to face me. I forgot that, somewhere along the way. I let Doug convince me that a few quarters of exaggeration were just smoothing things over until the market corrected itself, and then a few quarters became a few years, and I told myself I hadn't actually lied, because I hadn't personally typed the false numbers into the spreadsheet myself. I just signed my name underneath someone else's lie enough times that eventually the lie became mine too. He came and sat down across from me, and for the first time in 5 months, he looked at me not like a threat, but like his daughter. "You didn't betray this family, Claire. You were the only one of us who remembered what your grandfather actually meant." I won't pretend that conversation fixed everything instantly, because grief and betrayal, even misunderstood betrayal, even betrayal that turns out to have been love wearing a disguise, doesn't dissolve in a single evening just because the truth finally gets spoken out loud. It took months more for Grant to fully forgive me, and I understand, more than I let on to him at the time, why it was hard for him specifically. He had spent his whole life positioning himself as the child who protected the company, the loyal one, the one who never questioned, and my choice forced him to reckon with the uncomfortable possibility that loyalty and protection aren't always the same thing, that sometimes the person who looks the most disloyal in the moment is the one actually doing the protecting, while the people insisting on blind faith are the ones, without meaning to, walking the whole family closer to the edge. My aunt never fully apologized, not in so many words, though she did, about a year later, send me a card on the anniversary of my mother's death, the first one in 5 years, and I understood that for what it was, a version of an apology that some people are only capable of offering sideways. I've made peace with that too. Not everyone finds their way to saying the hard thing directly. Sometimes you have to accept the crooked path back toward someone, because the straight one asks more of them than they have. Doug Kessler served 18 months. I never spoke to him, not once, through any of it, though I read every piece of coverage about his sentencing, looking, I think, for some sense of closure that never quite arrived, because closure isn't really something a courtroom hands you. It's something you build slowly, out of ordinary days that stop being defined by the crisis. My father stepped down as CEO permanently, even after his ban technically expired, because he said, the one time we talked about it directly, that some things you don't get to go back to just because the calendar allows it. Grant runs the company now, and runs it well, with an obsessive attention to internal auditing controls that I think, in his own way, is Grant's version of the conversation my father and I had that night by the window, a promise made in spreadsheets instead of words. I left my old firm about a year after everything settled and started my own small advisory practice, one that, somewhat ironically, specializes in helping family-run companies build internal financial controls robust enough that no single person's silence or loyalty ever again becomes the only thing standing between the truth and a federal investigation. I like to think my grandfather would have understood that particular kind of business better than anyone. Here's what I've come to believe, sitting on the other side of all of it, and it's the thing I most want anyone listening to this to actually carry with them, more than the specifics of my family's particular story. We tend to think of loyalty and honesty as if they're always pointing in the same direction, as if loving someone and telling them a hard truth are the same gesture wearing different clothes. But sometimes they split apart from each other completely, and you're forced to choose. You can be the kind of loyal that protects a person's comfort in the moment, agreeing with them, shielding them from the parts of reality that would hurt to hear, standing beside them and saying everything is fine even when it isn't. Or you can be the kind of loyal that protects a person's future, even when doing so requires you to look, for a while, like the villain in their story instead of the ally. The second kind is so much harder, because it asks you to survive being hated by the very people you're trying to save, for exactly as long as it takes the truth to catch up to your intentions. Nobody claps for you in the moment. Nobody thanks you while it's happening. You just have to trust that the truth, eventually, moves at its own pace, and that pace is almost never as fast as you need it to be, and almost never as fast as the people judging you. I think about my father standing at that window a lot, telling me that the real estate business was never actually about buildings, it was about trust. I think he was right, but I'd go one step further now, because I've lived the harder version of that lesson. Trust isn't just about whether the walls will hold or whether the numbers are real. Trust is also about whether the people who love you are willing to let you misunderstand them for a while, if it means, in the end, you get to keep them. I was willing to be misunderstood by my father, by my brother, by my aunt, by strangers reading a headline with my name in it, because I loved what was underneath all of that misunderstanding more than I needed to be seen clearly in the moment. That's not a comfortable kind of love. It doesn't feel good while you're living inside it. But it is, I think, the most honest kind there is, because it asks nothing of the people you're protecting except the chance, someday, to finally understand. If there's one thing I'd want anyone in a family like mine to hold on to, it's this. Sometimes the person who looks like they're tearing everything down is actually the only one standing close enough to the fire to see it before it spreads. Don't mistake the person holding up the mirror for the person who broke the glass. And if you ever find yourself in my position, staring at numbers that don't add up, staring at a truth that will hurt someone you love no matter which way you carry it to them, remember that there is almost always a version of doing the right thing that costs you being loved correctly for a while. Choose it anyway. The people who are actually yours will eventually find their way back to understanding you. And the ones who don't, weren't standing on solid ground with you to begin with. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of your own family, your own hard choices, the times you had to let someone misunderstand you because the truth needed time to catch up, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And if you want more stories like this one, stay close, because there are more families, more quiet sacrifices, more truths that took the long way home, still waiting to be told.